All right, let's dive right in, shall we? We're tackling something you probably encounter every day, bottled water.
And not just any bottled water. Today we're looking at a pretty big recall, over 150,000 bottles.
Yeah, because of possible bacteria.
Exactly, potential contamination. And get this, it's actually the third bottled water recall just this year.
Third, okay, so that's starting to sound kind of concerning.
Makes you think, right? What's interesting is that this recall is classified as Class 3.
Class 3.
It means that it's unlikely to cause serious health problems for most people.
Okay, so maybe not panic-inducing, but still,
Not exactly the news you want to hear about something you're drinking.
definitely not. So what do we actually know about this specific recall?
Well, it affects Berkeley Springs water, both their purified and distilled varieties.
And these bottles were sold where?
Primarily distributed across a few states, West Virginia, Maryland, and Virginia.
Got it. You know, we mentioned those other recalls earlier, Fiji and Waiakea.
Right, and each of those had a different problem. Fiji had excess manganese, Waiakea had those strange floating particles, and this time it's coliform bacteria.
So 3 recalls, 3 different issues. It does make you wonder what's going on, right?
It definitely raises some questions.
But before we get into all that, let's talk about these coliform bacteria. What exactly are they, and should we be freaking out?
Totally valid question. Understanding coliforms is actually key to understanding the potential impact of this whole recall. Coliforms themselves aren't usually harmful. They're pretty common in the environment, believe it or not.
Really?
Yep. What makes them a concern is that they can sometimes indicate the presence of other more dangerous, pathogens.
Ah, so it's not the coliforms themselves necessarily, but what they might signal.
Exactly. It's like a warning sign, like a canary in a coal mine, telling you that something else might be off.
So finding coliforms in the water doesn't automatically mean you'll get sick, but it's definitely,
A red flag. It means further investigation is needed.
that makes sense. And I guess that's why the EPA uses the presence of coliforms as.
As an indicator of water quality. Exactly. They're relatively easy to test for.
So even though this recall is like low risk, finding these bacteria in bottled water, I mean, it's something to pay attention to, especially since it's, what, the 3rd recall this year?
Right.
I mean, how often are we supposed to be finding any bacteria in bottled water?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. You see, while finding any bacteria in bottled water isn't ideal, the bottling process, it's not foolproof.
I guess I never thought about that.
There are multiple stages where contamination can occur. Think about it from the source water itself to the treatment facilities, the bottling plants.
And even how the bottles are stored, right? Like in warehouses and during shipping.
Exactly. All of that can affect the final product.
Wow, so it really is like a chain. And if one link is weak, the whole thing can be compromised.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's so crucial to figure out the source of the contamination, to really understand the potential impact on people's health.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how do they even figure out where the contamination happened? Is it like a detective case? Tracking the bacteria back to its origin?
You could say that. It's a whole investigative process.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They test water samples from different stages of production. They inspect the facilities, review all sorts of records.
So they're trying to pinpoint exactly where those coliforms got into the bottles in the first place.
Exactly. And all that information helps them assess the risks to people and, put corrective actions in place to prevent it from happening again.
So we've got the recall, we've got coliform bacteria, but what does all this really mean for the people who might have already drunk this water? What are the potential health problems we're talking about?
That's the big question. And here's where understanding those other pathogens, the ones that coliforms might indicate, becomes really important.
So we're talking about things like E. coli, right?
Yes, E. coli. And other bacteria like Giardia.
Giardia. That sounds familiar.
It's a parasite that can cause some pretty unpleasant, gastrointestinal issues.
Okay, so we're talking about diarrhea, stomach cramps, nausea, that sort of thing.
Yeah, those are some common symptoms. And for most healthy adults, they're usually pretty mild and don't last too long.
So not a major health crisis for most people.
Right. But there are some groups that are more vulnerable to more serious complications.
Wow.
Young children, the elderly, and anyone with a compromised immune system.
So this recall might not be sending most people to the ER, but there are some folks out there who could be more seriously affected.
Absolutely. And that's why it's crucial to be aware of these recalls, check those product lists, and, take precautions, especially if you fall into one of those more vulnerable groups.
So what should people be doing to protect themselves? I mean, especially since this isn't the first bottled water recall we've seen this year.
Well, first things first, check your bottles. See if they match the specific brands and lot numbers listed in the recall notice.
And if you have any of those affected bottles,
Don't drink the water, return them to the store, or dispose of them properly.
okay, makes sense. But beyond this specific recall, what are some general tips for, like, staying safe when it comes to bottled water in general?
Well, pay attention to the news. Recalls are usually announced pretty widely. And be a discerning consumer.
What do you mean?
Check those labels, look for information about where the water comes from, maybe even do a little research on the brands you buy.
That's a good point. I know I tend to grab a bottle without really thinking about it.
We all do it.
Okay, so we've covered this specific recall, the bacteria involved, and the potential health impacts. But there's a bigger picture here,
Oh,
right?
you're getting it.
This isn't just about one brand, one batch of water. It raises questions about bottled water safety in general.
Exactly. This recall, along with the others we've seen this year, it highlights the importance of really understanding the bottled water industry and how complex it is. All those potential vulnerabilities in the process.
It's a reminder that even something as basic as water can have hidden risks.
Well said.
And that's kind of what we're here to do, right? Dig into those complexities and help people make informed choices about the water they drink.
That's the goal.
And the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore those complexities even further. We'll look at the regulations around bottled water, the different types of water out there, and, the steps consumers can take to stay safe.
Definitely a lot more to uncover.
Stay tuned, deep divers. There's much more to come.
Yeah.
We were just talking about coliform bacteria and how they can, indicate other problems. But I'm curious, what are some of those other, like, nasty bugs that could be lurking in contaminated water?
Well, there are a few usual suspects. E. coli, of course, I'm sure you've heard of that one.
Yeah, definitely.
And then there's Giardia.
Giardia.
It's a parasite that can cause, some pretty unpleasant gastrointestinal distress.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, not so much. Those are just a couple of examples, though. The specific pathogens that you might find can vary depending on a lot of things, like the source of the water, how it got contaminated.
Okay, so let's talk about the source of the water for a minute. When we see labels like spring water or purified water, does that actually tell us anything about, like, the potential risks?
It can give you some clues, but it's not a guarantee. Spring water, for example.
Yeah.
It's regulated by the FDA, and it's supposed to come from an underground source.
Okay, that makes sense.
But even spring water can be contaminated if the source itself is polluted, or if there are issues with, like, the collection process, bottling, all of that.
So that picture-perfect image of, like, pure water flowing from a mountain spring.
Might not always be the reality.
Right. And what about purified water?
Well, purified water can come from different places, even municipal tap water sometimes.
All right.
Yeah, and it goes through these extra purification processes to get rid of impurities. But again, how effective those processes are really depends on the technology they're using and how good their quality control is.
So no matter which type of bottled water you choose, there's always a certain level of trust involved. You're trusting that the company has done their job and made sure it's safe.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to be aware of the regulations and the agencies that oversee all of this.
Okay, so let's talk about those regulations. Who's in charge of making sure our bottled water is safe to drink?
In the United States, the main regulatory body is the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. They set standards for bottled water quality, labeling, manufacturing, all of that. But here's the interesting thing.
What's that?
The FDA's regulations for bottled water are actually less strict than the EPA's regulations for public drinking water.
Wait, really? That seems kind of odd. Why would bottled water have less strict regulations than tap water?
That's a good question, and it's one that's been debated for years. Part of it is historical, I think. Initially, bottled water was marketed as this luxury item, not an essential source of drinking water like tap water is.
So it was like this niche product that kind of flew under the radar as it became more popular.
Yeah, you could say that. And another factor is that bottled water is regulated as a food product, whereas tap water falls under the EPA, which has, a different set of priorities and regulations.
So even though we're basically talking about the same thing, water, it's treated differently depending on how it's packaged and sold.
It can be confusing, for sure, especially for people who are trying to understand the differences and make informed choices. And because of that difference in regulations, some consumer groups have been pushing for stricter oversight of the bottled water industry, saying it should be held to the same standards as public drinking water.
Interesting. So there's this debate about whether those regulations need to be tightened up. That's definitely something to keep in mind when we're considering the safety of our drinking water. But let's get back to those potential health impacts for a sec. We've talked about E. coli and Giardia, but are there other concerns beyond just like stomach problems?
Yeah, definitely. Certain contaminants like heavy metals or, chemical pollutants, those can have long-term health effects if you're exposed to them over time.
Oh, like what?
Well, lead contamination, for instance. It's pretty rare in bottled water, but it can be a serious issue, especially for pregnant women and young children.
Because of those developmental issues.
Exactly. It can affect cognitive development.
Hmm.
So it's not just about like immediate symptoms. Some contaminants can have more lasting consequences.
And those consequences can be more serious for certain groups of people.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to regularly test bottled water sources, make sure those contaminants are caught and dealt with before they reach anyone.
So even though this recall with Berkeley Springs water is considered low risk, it's a good reminder that we can't just assume bottled water is always safe.
We can't take it for granted.
There's a level of trust there, and we need to be informed and make conscious decisions about what we're drinking.
I agree.
Speaking of decisions, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about those alternatives to bottled water. I think it's time we dive into some other options, especially for people who are concerned about safety and those long-term health impacts.
Okay, sounds good. Let's explore those alternatives and see what might be a better fit for people. So, we've been talking about those potential risks with bottled water, but let's shift gears a little bit. Let's think about some other ways to stay hydrated.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We've kind of gotten so used to just grabbing bottled water. We don't even think about other options sometimes.
It's true. And those other options can often be, easier on your wallet and better for the environment too. So, let's start with the most obvious one, tap water.
Good old tap water.
Yes, exactly.
And in a lot of places, tap water is perfectly safe to drink. It goes through tons of testing and treatment to meet those EPA standards.
Absolutely. And those standards, they're often even stricter than the ones for bottled water. Plus, tap water is usually way cheaper,
Yeah.
especially if you think about it in terms of, cost per gallon.
So before you go spending money on all those fancy bottles, it's definitely worth looking into the quality of your tap water.
For sure. Your local water utility, they should have reports you can look at. They'll tell you about the source of the water, the treatment processes, all the testing they do for contaminants.
You can usually find that stuff online, right? On their website or something.
Yeah, their website, or just give them a call.
Easy enough.
Yeah.
But what if you're still not sure about your tap water? Or you have specific concerns about it? Are there other options?
Oh, absolutely. Home filtration systems are a great way to go if you want to be extra sure. And there are all sorts of filters out there, from those simple pitcher filters to, like under sink systems or even whole house systems.
Yeah, and I've even seen those filters that like remineralize the water. They add back minerals that get taken out during filtration.
Yeah, that's a growing trend for sure, as people are learning more about how important minerals are for their health.
So we got tap water, we've got filtration systems. Any other alternatives worth mentioning?
Well, if you still want that convenience of like grabbing a bottle and going, you could always get a reusable water bottle
Mm.
and fill it with filtered water at home or wherever.
Oh yeah, those are great. They're good for the environment and, they can save you a lot of money over time.
Totally. Investing in a good reusable bottle is a win-win. You're reducing plastic waste, and you always have clean water with you.
And, they come in some pretty cool designs these days.
Oh, definitely.
So it seems like we've got a lot of alternatives to bottled water, and they each have their own, pros and cons.
For sure.
Whether it's the cost or the convenience or the environmental impact, it all comes down to what you need and what you prefer.
Exactly. But the main thing is we do have options. We don't have to rely on bottled water all the time.
But, it's kind of crazy how something as essential as water can lead to such a complex discussion.
Yeah, it shows how everything is connected, right? The choices we make about something as simple as what we drink it can affect our health, our wallets, even the environment.
And that's why it's so important to, stay informed, ask questions. Think about those everyday choices we're making.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We talked about that bottled water recall, those potential risks, and some great alternatives for staying hydrated.
Yeah, we really did a deep dive into the topic, and hopefully everyone listening feels like they can make some more informed choices about their drinking water now.
That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive. So until next time, stay curious and stay hydrated.